Hello and welcome back. So in this lecture we're going to talk about gas exchange. Now be careful, gas exchange does not mean circulation of gases through the body, but it means a structure or an organ that allows for the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. And there are many ways that animals do this. So you can have diffusion across the cell membrane. So that's a very common way that animals will diffuse gases. And if you talk about like sponges, diffusion across the cell membrane is how they do it. Your cnidarians and platyhelminthes, your flatworms, they're going to use diffusion across the cell membrane. But that's not the only way that gas exchange can occur. Gas exchange can also occur across the skin. So if you have an amphibian or some kind of other creature that has skin that's permeable to gases, then that's a way that they can actually do that. There are other organisms that use gills, and there's different kinds of gills. There's external gills and there's internal gills, and we'll look at those and talk about those in a minute. There's also a tracheal system used by insects, and we'll look at that one, and then we'll talk more exclusively about lungs, which is the system that mammals and organisms like yourself use for gas exchange. So this is an interesting salamander that we have here in Virginia, and this is called the Yanalasi salamander, and it's a type of salamander that exclusively uses its skin to get carbon dioxide out and oxygen in. So it's exclusively a skin breather, and it actually does not have lungs. So if you were to go in and look for lungs, it doesn't have lungs. It's part of the group of salamanders that we have in Virginia called the lungless salamanders. So if you ever have one as a pet, you want to make sure that it's in a moist area. Most of the time these are found under logs, or they're found in wet areas, and they will excrete mucus on the surface of their skin to allow for the exchange of gases. So it has to have a moist surface all the time. We also have in Virginia the hellbender. Yeah, we actually have this salamander in Virginia. It's called the it's a type of giant salamander, and it uses exclusively its skin for breathing. You can see the skin is folded. You can kind of see the skin's folded there. Those folds increase the surface area, and the animal has capillaries right underneath the skin that allow for the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen into its body. So it's amazing that we have this in Virginia. It's a beautiful animal, and it's found in Western Virginia, and they're amazing creatures. So the frog is kind of a hybrid organism. It's gonna use its skin to do some respiration, so some carbon dioxide and some oxygen are going to come into and out. But it does still have nostrils, so it does have lungs. If you went inside here, there would be lungs inside here. So in a little trachea going down to the lungs, and so it utilizes a hybrid system of lungs and skin. When you get into creatures like toads that have more of a dry skin, so this one has kind of this southern leopard frog here has a moist skin. But if you get into toads that have dry skin, they're going to use more of their lungs as opposed to their skin for breathing. So this is an axolotl, and this is an example of an amphibian, a salamander, that uses external gills. So it can do gas exchange through its skin, but it also has these gills here that allow for gas exchange to occur. If you were to look at one of these, little parts of the gill, you would notice that inside there would be blood vessels that are carrying blood into and out of this structure here. And as of course as water moves across it, it brings in oxygen, and carbon dioxide is excreted out. So that's kind of an interesting system there. And if you were to add up all of these little gill parts, that's a huge amount of surface area that allows for gas exchange to occur. So these are called external gills, and these are used by many different kinds of creatures. I just used an example of a salamander on this picture. There's also internal gills, and in internal gills, you have water coming in through the mouth, and then it exits, and this is an example using a tadpole, and it exits this little hole called a spiracle. So oxygen comes in, and what goes out will be carbon dioxide going out. And it has gills on the inside that the water passes across, and those are called internal gills. Now, a frog is a pretty complex organism because it goes through a cycle where, it has internal gills and then it switches over to having lungs and no gills. So that's a pretty complex metamorphosis that it actually goes through. And so this is just a graphic showing you that external gills have a lot of surface area on the outside. Internal structures like lungs have all the parts on the inside. So these creatures are usually tied to water. Having external gills, you have to have water moving across the gills. And then these creatures, this vertebrate like the rabbit, is going to be more terrestrial. So it's having everything inside. Now the lungs are moist inside, so this type of gill up here has to have moisture on the outside. Now, most of you probably have gone fishing before and you've caught fish or have eaten fish, and fish utilize a system of gills. So their gills are on the inside, and there is a covering over the surface of this called an operculum. And if you flip the operculum up, you can actually see inside and see the gills on the inside. So these gills right here are going back and forth. So water passes across them. So if you see water coming in, it's bringing oxygen, and when it leaves, it's taking carbon dioxide out. So you can see there's a tremendous amount of surface area in these gills. If you look at the gills in a more microscopic view, you will see that oxygen pore blood is coming in through this vessel, and then the blood cells are moving through this capillary bed to this direction over here, and then oxygen-rich blood is going out through this vessel. Now, as water flows across, it brings oxygen, okay, and will take out carbon dioxide. Okay, so the blood, as it goes from this side to this side, is picking up more and more oxygen, then it's taking that oxygen to the cells of the body, which is kind of a cool system. In insects use a tracheal system, and since there's probably more insects than there are any other kind of animal, this is one of the most common types of systems for respiration that there are. And so if you've ever noticed an insect's body looks like this, and we're talking about really the abdomen. And if you look at the abdomen of a live insect, you'll see there's lots of little holes, and these are called spiracles. And these holes, they will open up. So if I look at a spiracle over here in a more magnified view, here's the spiracle, and it has trachea, which are tubes that lead and branch all through the insect's body. You can see there's little small tracheae, tracheoles, and then you can see they eventually will end in some kind of an air sac where they can store oxygen, or they literally take oxygen to the cells of the body. Okay, so they have lots and lots of these spiracles, and they have tremendous amounts of these branching tubes all throughout their body, and this is what we call a tracheal system. The tracheal system means you start with a spiracle and then you branch into a tracheal tree, and so it carries oxygen to all the cells of the body, and it brings out carbon dioxide, which is a waste gas. Okay, now this is a very common system since there are more insects than all other animals combined. Okay, and what we want to focus on for the rest of this lecture is the mammalian respiratory system. So we're going to look at the respiratory system that consists of these parts: the lungs, the trachea, and it's the system that you have. So the respiratory system we're going to talk about consists of tubes that filter incoming air. They transport that air to the microscopic air sacs called alveoli, where the gases are going to be exchanged. The carbon dioxide and oxygen are going to be exchanged. So I'll go through each one of these parts with you and highlight what each job of those parts is. Now, respiration is kind of tricky. There's all kinds of parts of respiration. Ventilation is the physical movement of gases into and out of the lungs. Gas exchange is the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the respiratory membrane. I'll show you what that respiratory membrane looks like in just a second and sketch it out for you. But that's the movement of gases from the across the respiratory membrane from the lungs to the blood cells, the red blood cells inside of capillaries. And then lastly, cellular respiration is when you take food and oxygen, and in the mitochondria you create carbon dioxide as a waste gas and ATP as an energy source. So that's what we call cellular respiration. Okay, so you should know the definitions of each of those, and if you need to go back and review, just review the tape. All right, now the respiratory system doesn't have a super huge number of parts, but each part is very critical to the functioning. We do have, as mammals, we do have nostrils, and the nostrils lead to a nasal cavity, which is a space inside of your nasal region. And the nasal cavity has all kinds of folds, and they have mucous membranes. These folds warm the air, they moisten the air, and because they have mucus, they can trap particles and bacteria and remove them before they get to structures lower down inside the body. Now, we do have a backup system. We have an oral cavity. The oral cavity and nasal cavity both combine in what we call the pharynx, or the back of your throat. So you probably have had the situation where you consumed some kind of beverage and then it came out of your nostrils. So you know that those particular structures are connected. Moving on down from the pharynx is the larynx and eventually the trachea. So air will come in through and go down into the trachea, you hope. So there is a combined place where the esophagus and the larynx kind of have a combined area right there in the pharynx. And to prevent food from going down into your air tube, we do have this little fold of skin called the epiglottis. I'm just going to kind of shade it in there for you to see. This epiglottis will close over the air tube when you swallow, but when you're not swallowing, the epiglottis is in an uncontracted state. And so let me just kind of go back to uncontracted state. So that's a problem area. You know, we do choke oftentimes on steak or something we don't chew correctly. So that's kind of that area right there is kind of a weakened area in my opinion, because you have air and food moving by the same area. So it can be a problem. So the trachea is the tube that leads down into eventually your lungs. The trachea will branch into the primary bronchi, and then eventually they branch into trees and terminate into what we call bronchioles, which is the smallest branches of the trees. Now, you know, the reason that trees have lots of branches is so they can hold lots of leaves and increase the surface area for photosynthesis. The reason we have a tracheal tree coming down, or excuse me, a bronchial tree coming down, is so that we can increase the amount of surface area, because at the end of these little terminal bronchioles are going to be air sacs that are going to be functional in gas exchange. So the nose is important because it warms and moistens air, and that's what happens in the nasal cavity as well. The pharynx is the back of your throat, and it leads to the larynx. The larynx is going to be a structure that contains your vocal cords for allowing us to speak or to make vocalizations if you're a different kind of, if we're talking about other kinds of animals. The trachea is going to be the tube that carries the air down into the bronchial tree. Now the trachea is lined with a ciliated mucous membrane. So that means the cells have cilia, and they produce, this is what we call a goblet cell, it produces mucus. Now the mucus is sticky, and it's a mucopolysaccharide, so it's a sticky protein that traps bacteria. The cilia beat in unison and actually push the mucus out of the trachea. So every once in a while when you swallow, you know, the mucus that's been formed so I'm just drawing trachea. Mucus that's formed here will actually come and drop over into the esophagus and go down to your stomach to kill the bacteria that you have basically produced. And if you have a disease like cystic fibrosis, you make a really thick mucus, and it's hard to extract that mucus out of the lungs. So you have to have massages and other therapy to get the mucus out. That bronchial tree is a tree, and it branches to increase the surface area for gas exchange to eventually occur. And then just the lungs are the sacs that will contain the bronchial tree and the little air sacs. And this is just showing you a picture, a little bit more blown up picture of the nostrils and your nasal cavity. And here is your oral cavity. Here's the pharynx, the back of the throat. There's your epiglottis. Excuse me. There's your epiglottis right there. And then that's the way that gases move in. So into the larynx and eventually the trachea. So food moves through the esophagus. Again, a problem area. So this is just showing you a frontal view. You can see the larynx or the voice box, and you can see the trachea, the tube that carries the air down into the bronchial tubes in the bronchial tree. Eventually, those tubes will branch and branch and branch, and eventually they'll terminate, and they'll terminate into an alveolar duct and into a little cluster of air sacs called the alveolus. Okay, so this is just showing you a cluster of these air sacs. Now, when I say there's a lot of alveoli, I really mean that. If you were to take and put all the alveoli and flatten them out, they would fit on the side. They would be the size of a tennis court. So it's a tremendous amount of surface area that allows for gas exchange to actually occur. There's a lot of things that make the alveoli really good for gas exchange. The first thing is that there's a lot of them. The second thing is that they're thin. They're only made of one cell, they're only one cell layer thick, so it's really easy for gas exchange to occur through them. There's a lot of surface area. And lastly, they have really tremendous amounts of capillaries. So lots of capillaries are going to be covering and surrounding these particular structures. As you can see up here, there's lots of capillaries there. Okay, so there's a lot of them. They're thin. There are tremendous amounts of surface area. Again, they fit on the size of a tennis court, and there's tremendous numbers of capillaries that are going to capture the gases that are being exchanged. Okay, and you can see kind of a good view of the capillaries wrapped around it right there. So in terms of the breathing mechanism, ventilation is what we call breathing, and it is the movement of air in and out of the lungs. Now, you can imagine if you didn't have ventilation, you would not have any gas exchange. And when you don't have gas exchange, carbon dioxide will build up inside your body, and your body will be depleted in oxygen. So, if you ever do something on the rescue squad or within the medical field, we always teach you about the ABCs. You always worry about people having an airway. If they don't have an airway, they're definitely not exchanging air. So we check to see if they're choking on something. We always make sure people are breathing, and when they're not breathing, we start CPR for that. And then we start worrying about circulation. So you can take, a pulse point, feel a pulse point, see if the heart's breathing or heart's beating. If the heart's not beating, that's a problem, and that's when you start doing CPR. And then you start thinking about disability, and you can work on other things. If people do not have an airway, they're not breathing, and they're not circulating blood, they're dying. So that's why we try to teach as many people as we can CPR, because that can sustain a person long enough for the rescue squad to get there, and they have a defibrillator and can restart the heart and have better equipment to help circulation. So ventilation includes inspiration and expiration. And in inspiration, inspiration is where you allow atmospheric pressure to force air into the lungs. Now, sitting on top of you right now where you sit is about 760 millimeters of mercury of pressure from the column of air that's a mile thick sitting on top of you. That atmospheric pressure is a force. You can't really feel it, but if you were in space, there wouldn't be any force, and you wouldn't have the ability to breathe at all. Your lungs wouldn't work because there's no air pressure there. So we do require, as a species, air pressure. If you go underwater, you can feel the pressure increase, so that's something you can actually feel. But sitting there right now, you probably don't feel 760 millimeters of mercury pressing on you. But this atmospheric air pressure is really important. When the pressure inside of your lungs decreases, the higher air pressure will flow naturally in. So this is just a matter of movement of pressure. So if I decrease the pressure inside my lungs, I can allow air to flow in. If I if I if I decrease if I increase the pressure inside my lungs and it's higher than 760 millimeters of mercury, air will actually flow out of the lungs. So how can you decrease the air pressure inside of your lungs? Well, you can decrease the pressure inside your lungs by increasing the size of your chest cavity. So if you just take a deep breath in, what you're doing is you're increasing the size of your thoracic cavity and increasing the size of your lungs, and it's decreasing the pressure inside of your lungs and air's flowing in. Okay, so we actually have several ways we can increase the size of the thoracic cavity. We have a diaphragm, which is a muscle that is at the bottom of the thoracic cavity that drops down, thus increasing the size of the cavity. We also have external intercostal muscles, which when they do their job, they will take and expand. They're attached to the ribs, and when they contract, they expand the rib cage and thus increasing the size of the cavity, which decreases the pressure inside the cavity. So as the lungs expand in size, the reason they don't stick together is that there is a chemical called surfactant that is produced by the alveoli. Now, you've probably taken two pieces of glasses and put them together before with water in between. You can't pull them apart. Well, the lungs are the same way. You have these membranes, that are side by side, and there's water in between. But there's this surfactant is an oily chemical that prevents them from sticking together. So our lungs don't collapse, each time we inhale or exhale because of this surfactant. Now, if you're born prematurely, you don't produce surfactant, and that's why babies that are born prematurely, if they're not put on respirators, they'll die because their lung tissue will stick to each other or stick to the walls of the thoracic cavity, and the baby will suffocate. So premature babies are put on respirators to allow them to survive until they start producing surfactant. Now, expiration is going to be due to many factors. The elastic recoil of lung tissue and muscle tissue is going to be the primary way that expiration occurs. And so there's also a little bit of surface tension that allows for the alveoli to want to go back to a non-inflated state. Forced expiration can happen though. So I can force expiration because I have thoracic and abdominal muscles that allow me to compress down the thoracic cavity, make it smaller. Also, I can force my diaphragm up, thus making the thoracic cavity smaller. So if I just kind of drew the lungs in here, here's our thoracic cavity. There's a diaphragm right there that if I drop it down, I can allow air to flow in, but if I raise it up and push it against the thoracic cavity, I can push air out of the lungs. This is just a graphic showing you that here we have 760 millimeters of mercury coming in from the air pressure. And if I take and drop the diaphragm or increase the size of the thoracic cavity, as you can see, this is increasing the size of the thoracic cavity, the pressure goes down, thus forcing atmospheric pressure in. So it's a physical movement of gases. If I take and reverse that and force the diaphragm up or force the thoracic cavity smaller, I push air, I increase the air pressure inside the lungs and force the air out. It's greater than atmospheric air pressure. I don't know where to put my face, so I'm going to put it right there. So, so the alveoli are the only sites of gas exchange in humans and in invertebrates such as rabbits and dogs. So, this gas exchange has to occur between the atmosphere and the blood. Okay. Now, gases that are in the atmosphere do you no good if they don't get in the blood, and there are gases in the blood that you want to get to the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide, so you can get those out of your body. So the alveoli are tiny air sacs. They're clustered at the ends of the alveolar ducts. And you can go back and look at that picture if you want to see what those alveolar ducts look like. Some people describe them as like clusters of grapes, kind of looking like clusters of grapes, but they're really microscopic. They're really small. So the respiratory membrane is going to consist of epithelial cells. They're going to be flat epithelial cells, and these are going to make up the wall of the alveolus. And Also, the respiratory membrane consists of the cells, the endothelial or epithelial cells that are making up the walls of the capillary, and that's only 1 cell layer thick. There's then this proteinaceous, almost like cell glue in between them called the basement membranes. But that's going to be also making up this thing called the respiratory membrane. And gas exchange will only occur through this respiratory membrane. I'm going to take a chance of drawing it for you here. So if we were to take a look at the air sacs are only 1 cell layer thick. So I'm just drawing the wall of one of the alveoli. It's only 1 cell layer thick. We then have the capillary. So here's the wall of the capillary. It's only 1 cell layer thick. Just imagine this is a capillary. It's kind of a bad capillary, but it is a capillary. And then you have a blood cell inside. Let's see if I can get this right here. So then you have a blood cells that are inside. That's a blood cell. We then have the basement membrane. So this is the basement membrane between these cells right here. And this is what we call this whole structure is called the respiratory membrane. So oxygen is going to pass by this respiratory membrane. It's going to go through the epithelial cells of the alveolus. It's going to go through the basement membrane. It's going to go through the 1 cell layer thick cells, and it's going to go into the capillary. Of course, eventually it's going to make its way into a red blood cell, and that's how it's going to be circulated through the body. On the flip side of that, carbon dioxide has to go out this way. Now, if this were a really thick membrane, it would not occur. But since it's only, a couple cell layers thick, it occurs very easily, and it diffuses very easily. If you look inside of the alveoli, you're going to see that they're made of type 1 alveolar cells. These particular cells are going to make up the walls of the alveolus. There's also type 2 alveolar cells, and these are cells that secrete that surfactant, that oily chemical that doesn't allow the air sacs to stick together. There's also going to be macrophages. These are immune system cells or white blood cells that help to gobble up bacteria or other organisms or cellular debris that may be inside of your lungs. And here you can see the respiratory membrane, so it's only 2 cell layers thick between these the wall of the alveolus and the capillary wall. So let's talk about how these gases are going to diffuse. Now, gases always follow this physical principle. They move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. Okay, that's a really key fact, and I'll show you some graphics of that in just a second. Now, let me just talk about this for just a second. So, in a mixture of gases, so if you have a bottle, and let's say there's a mixture of gases inside the bottle, each gas is going to account for a portion of the total pressure. The amount of each gas, the amount of pressure that each gas exerts is called its partial pressure. So if I had a bottle and I looked at the gases inside, let me just kind of erase this real quickly. If I had a bottle and I looked at the gases inside, the total pressure is all the gases, all the pressures, all the partial pressures of all the gases that are inside. So here's a bottle. So maybe I have carbon dioxide, maybe I have nitrogen, maybe I have oxygen. So if I take and add up all of these are going to be total pressure, but each of them will have their own partial pressure. Okay, so each of them will have their own partial pressure that they make up of the total volume. When the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the alveolar air than it is in the capillary blood, oxygen is going to move towards the blood. So it moves from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. When the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is greater in the blood than it is in the alveolar air, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the blood and into the alveolus. Okay, this is a really important concept to kind of understand how these gases are moving. It's all, again, a physical process, and you don't use energy to really do it. So let's look at inspired air. Inspired air, you can see it's made of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. And you can see there's 150 millimeters of mercury, and 0.3 of a millimeter of mercury, and 6 millimeters of mercury. If we get down to the alveolus, oxygen is about 100 carbon dioxide's 40, the water, water vapor is increased to 47. So blood that's coming to the alveolus through a capillary has a composition of gases normally that looks like this. So 40 millimeters of mercury oxygen and 46 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide. Now, if you notice, when blood comes into the across the alveolus, the partial pressure of oxygen inside the alveolus is greater, therefore it moves into the bloodstream. And you can see that carbon dioxide is greater in the venous blood than it is in the alveolar blood, so it moves into the alveolus. So that's how we get rid of carbon dioxide, and that's how we get oxygen into the cells of the body. So blood going out of the lungs is going to have a much greater oxygen content, so 95 millimeters of mercury, and the carbon dioxide content is dropped, which is a good thing. Now, if you're in a burning building and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases, this can disrupt the system, okay, greatly. And if you are at a high altitude place and the partial pressure of oxygen is really, really super low, again, this particular system will be disrupted and will cause problems and complications for the animal. All right, this is just showing a kind of a graphic. It's showing you oxygen molecules inside the air sac, and it's showing you hemoglobin molecules with oxygen attached. So blood coming in has very little oxygen, but blood going out has much greater oxygen. So again, it goes to 95 millimeters of mercury. Now, when you get down to the tissues, notice that the tissues have a partial pressure of oxygen, and so partial pressure of oxygen of 40 millimeters of mercury. Well, 95 is greater than 40, so the oxygen will go to the tissues of the body. Okay, so this is really ingenious how this works. Now, of course, after blood flows out of the tissues, it's lost a lot of its partial pressure of oxygen because it unloaded it to the tissues of the body. Now it's going to go back to the lungs to pick up more oxygen, because remember, at the lungs, it's 100 millimeters of mercury. Partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters of mercury, so it can pick up more oxygen. And this is just showing you what happens with the carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide coming from the lungs is going to be about 40 millimeters of mercury, but at the tissues, it's 45 millimeters of mercury. So carbon dioxide is going to be offloaded to the lungs because of the partial pressure being greater at the tissues. And then when it leaves the capillaries from those tissues, it's going to be much higher. It'll go to the lungs, dump the carbon dioxide off, and come back to pick up more carbon dioxide. Now, again, this can be disrupted in many different kinds of ways. If you go into the healthcare field, you're going to spend a lot of time learning about how carbon dioxide and oxygen are carried so that you can treat patients and keep them alive. Now, gases are transported in association with molecules in the blood, or they're either dissolved in plasma, one or the other. So oxygen transport, most oxygen, 98% of oxygen, is carried by a protein inside of blood cells, red blood cells, called hemoglobin. And when oxygen combines with the hemoglobin, it forms what we call oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin is how most of the oxygen is carried in our body. Now, oxyhemoglobin, thankfully, is unstable when it goes to areas where oxygen is low. So if you take oxygen and you pack it onto hemoglobin in the lungs and carry it to the tissues of the body where oxygen is low, this molecule will become unstable, and it's going to give up its oxygen molecules and release them to those areas that need the oxygen. When oxygen is released as the blood concentration, so oxygen is going to be released under different kinds of circumstances. So if carbon dioxide increases in amount, oxygen is going to be released. If blood becomes acidic, oxygen is going to be released. If blood temperatures increase, oxygen is going to be released to the tissues. And so when you exercise, you increase the amount of carbon dioxide that you form because you're making more ATP. You are making your body more acidic because of the release of lactic acid and carbon dioxide, and your blood temperature goes up because you're exercising muscles and they're contracting and creating body heat. So exactly the conditions that exist where you need oxygen to be released, it's actually released by those conditions. If you have a deficiency in oxygen, it's actually called hypoxia, and it has a variety of causes. For example, you can get a hypoxia from not having enough blood cells. You can get hypoxia from losing blood, internal bleeding, and just in an inefficiency of your lung tissue from ventilating. So there's a lot of reasons that you can get hypoxia. There's a lot of cures for it too. So carbon dioxide is transported mainly dissolved in blood plasma. So it's transported as a bicarbonate ion. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. It can also be transported on hemoglobin. When it joins with hemoglobin, it forms a molecule called carbanoaminohemoglobin, and it's just hemoglobin that has carbon dioxide attached to it. So people like to think of hemoglobin molecule as being like almost like a roller coaster ride where you have seats that things can sit in it. So sometimes oxygen can sit in it, sometimes carbon dioxide can sit in it. Carbon monoxide really likes to sit in it and will not ever get out. And that's why carbon monoxide is so dangerous. So most carbon dioxide, though, is transmitted as bicarbonate. Okay, this is a molecule that we can use to transport safely carbon dioxide to the lungs. When carbon dioxide is produced by the cells and goes into the plasma of your blood, it reacts with water to form an acid called carbonic acid. Okay, and this carbonic acid will be formed because there's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that will catalyze that reaction. So carbonic acid will actually be formed by the same enzyme into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, and that's how it's carried mainly in the bloodstream. And also carbanoaminohemoglobin, which is carbon dioxide on hemoglobin molecules, can release its carbon dioxide, when it gets to the alveolar ducts, or excuse me, the alveoli, and it can release it out of the body. Okay, so here's that reaction. This is a really important reaction. Now, hopefully you maybe saw this in Biology 101, but this is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffering system. So when we take and produce a lot of when we produce a lot of carbon dioxide, it's not letting me take my stylus pen and do anything with it. Let me see if I can try that one more time. Okay, we'll try a highlighter. So when I take and make a lot of carbon dioxide, my body it'll naturally react with water because there's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that allows this to occur. And with this reaction, it forms carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is a weak acid. It's not going to like fry your body, but naturally the carbonic anhydrase will convert it to hydrogen ions, and it'll convert it to bicarbonate ions. Okay, so bicarbonate will actually, if this is inside a blood cell, bicarbonate will actually shift outside of the blood cell and just sit as bicarbonate in the plasma of your blood. Okay, now the reason that this is pretty important is that if you are taking in too much carbon dioxide or have too much carbon dioxide, it doesn't immediately kill you because your kidneys can excrete hydrogen ions and it can excrete bicarbonate ions and thus buffer your body from becoming too acidic or too basic. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Let me just release that ink there and go back to showing you when your blood cells, remember this is a blood cell right here. Let's see if I can get that highlighter back. So this is a blood cell right here. So when your blood cells get to the air ducts, this bicarbonate will go back into the blood cell. It'll combine with hydrogen ions, form carbonic acid, and then shift this way and drop carbon dioxide off out of the lungs. Okay, water stays inside. So your lungs can aid in this carbonic acid bicarbonate buffering system, but also your kidneys can also help to buffer your body if let's say you have too much acid or too much base, too much carbon dioxide. The lungs and the kidneys all will aid you in protecting your body. If you ever go into the medical field, you're going to spend a lot of time learning about the lungs and a lot of time learning about the kidneys. If you ever work as a veterinarian assistant, you're going to learn a lot about the lungs and a lot about the kidneys. When these organs shut down, you are dead. So with that being said, that will be the end of this lecture. So I look forward to seeing and talking with you next time. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to email, and I wish you a good day.